Okay, so today at the start of week 6, let us talk about CNNs a little bit more. So last day we learned about CNNs, how they are, how the forward process, how the forward pass happens, how the backward pass happens in CNNs, and we understand what it does now. Now we need to explain what is going on inside them. So, so you have seen that for neural networks there is a very set, you know, method of um, what do I call it? There is a very set algorithm that goes on in a neural network. So you have a chunk of training data, lots of training data. What you do is you just forward pass that training data and through the neural network. So that is step number one in your algorithm. And then what do you do? That because of your forward pass, you have incurred certain loss, right? Through the neural network. And next, what you need to do? You need to just compute gradient of that loss with respect to all your learnable weight parameters and just back propagate them back to your network so that your weights are learned. So this forward pass and backward pass, this cycle of learning, this is common to all networks. So be it a CNN or suppose some other RNN or other complicated neural networks that are there, whatever the architecture, underlying architecture may be, this algorithm always remains the same. So there's a forward pass and there's a backward pass. But now one thing is noticeable, I'm sure you guys have seen this somewhere, that whenever suppose you are forward propagating a neural network, right? So you have seen that neural networks perform often so much better than your suppose your traditional image processing techniques, text processing techniques, classical image processing, classical NLP. So neural networks have managed to surpass all of these, right? But the problem is that the classical methods, whatever they were, we had a good grasp of them. We understood what worked why, right? But while that used to happen, the problem with neural networks was that we have no idea. I mean, we have ideas, but it's a little bit fuzzy, like why the neural networks work at all. Okay, so why do they work at all? Why, you know, they give such good results? So all those things. We do not really know about. That's a little bit fuzzy to us. That is why once we have gone through CNNs, we want to visualize them as well. We want to understand what's going inside CNNs, right? So let's have a look at this. Um, so there's some very simple ways of visualizing what is going on inside the CNN, right? So first, this is a typical CNN architecture. So you start with an input image, then you have multiple conv layers, pooling layers, and so on. Then at the end of it, when you have sufficiently reduced your your input size, then what you do, now what you have done is now what you have done is you have been able to sufficiently reduce your size to a smaller dimension maybe, which you can now increase, which you can now which you can now flatten, and you can convert it into a fully connected layer, right? And this fully connected layer you pass you pass through to your classifier basically, which gives you back your classes, right? So that is how a CNN works. Now, there are certain methods of looking into what the CNN is doing, right? So, one thing that we know about is that suppose one method of doing this is something like, so what do you have in the image? Suppose you have some suppose 224 cross 224 cross 3 dimensional images you might have. So these are they are all color images, and you know how to visualize them. Now what you do next, suppose you have this first layer of convolution. Okay, so first layer of convolution, what does it have? It has certain height, certain width, and along with that a certain depth. This depth is basically dependent on the number of filters you had used in the first layer. So suppose here it's like 64, right? Now what you can do is, you can, how to visualize this, if you take this thing as a whole, this is not an image, right? There are 64 channels, not 3 channels that we expect in an image. So what people tend to do here is that you simply take each activation map at a time and you visualize that as a grayscale image maybe, right? So you do it for each of these 64 and you get some visualizations like this, right? They are the raw weights basically. uh, so they kind of give you an idea of what are in these activation maps. So you'll see that there are things like edges or very very low level details of the image, right? So that means what, that what are these convolutional layers capable of? They are basically, so you have given the image. The first convolute takes care of the very very low level features of the image, right? As and when you move on in the network, sorry, as and when you move on in the network, the convolution layers, they become more and more, so they start looking at more complex things. Okay, so while it was like suppose just the edges in the first layer, in the second layer you get things like corners, in the third layer you get something else, something more complicated, until in the last convolution layer it's as if you are looking at the entire image as a whole. So it's like you are starting from small things and you are going towards big things. So that is one way of interpreting the different convolution layers. There is another way which is something like this. So it's like, suppose um, you have a fully connected layer like this. Then what you can do is, so this is basically some learned feature vector from your image. So this is like a feature represent vector representation of your 2D image. What you can do is, you can do because this is, suppose this is 4096 dimensional, you can just reduce the dimension using some PCA technique or TSNE, and then you can visualize the learned features here, right? You can also do some clustering for each class. So suppose there's a dog class, a cat class, a tiger class, and so on. So you can also do clustering to visualize, like how in the feature space, how do the individual features look like. Then there's another method like occlusion. So occlusion means what? That you have, suppose these different images of different animals, dogs, and so on. So what you do is, you suppose you block some parts of this image, right? Like this, you mask some parts of this image, and what happens is that you once you pass this image, forward pass this image through this, you see like what class is being um, predicted, right? So suppose you pass this image, you pass one such image, right? And your prediction changes. That means what? That this particular, suppose that you pass this image and your dog prediction changes. That means that this particular black patch, I mean, the original patch was actually necessary for the model to figure out that this was a dog, right? So similar occlusions you can do to understand, what part of the image is actually necessary for doing this. Okay, just give me a second. All right. So that is another way of looking at the visualizing the neurons, visualizing what the CNN is basically doing. So visualizing means kind of trying to understand like what is going on, right? What the CNN is trying to do. Similarly, okay, so there is another method like this, for example. So what you try to do here is, you are trying to see, like for example, you take the last convolutional layer, and what you do here is, you are basically just trying to understand that suppose how do I explain it? Yeah, so you give it. give these, all these images as input to the model, and you are seeing that, uh, suppose you have chosen so as I said that these are all neurons in the neural network. In the activation maps, the individual cells are basically nothing but neurons. So you choose a certain neuron here, and you are trying to see like, suppose what is your, so all of these images, which of them triggered that neuron the most, right? So suppose if the neuron is looking for faces, right? So faces of anything, suppose, then what will happen is, if you send an image with a face, then that particular image will, so the neuron here will be activated the most by that image, right? The neuron that you have chosen. So it's like this. So it's basical, and the activation value is given by these numbers, right? So this is how you can visualize like what each of these neurons want to learn, right? So instead of going for something like, like visualizing what is going on inside this picture, you are just trying to see like what you want to learn, what these neurons individually they want to learn through, through this kind of a visualization technique. Right. So the techniques that I showed you guys here is, like somewhat one. Obviously, what you are doing is you are taking in the different parts of the network and you are trying to understand, what these different parts are representing. But now there's a separate technique called class activation map, which actually goes inside the network, right? It doesn't train or anything. So suppose you have been given a trained network where you have been given an image like this, and suppose it's like an animal classifier, right? You have a network like this, a big one, and suppose your true class is this Australian terrier. Okay, so now what you'll try to do is, um, you'll try to understand what these individual, suppose these convolutions are, right? What they basically represent. So what you do is something like this, that you have a gap layer. Okay, so you have a convolution layer like this and you have a gap layer. What does the gap layer do? I'll explain a little bit more in the next slide probably. But yeah, in a nutshell, what it tries to do is it has a, suppose, so there are activations like this: blue, red, green, and so on. So these activations are there, right? And then what you do is, so you need to aggregate these activations in some sense. All right. So what you all you need to do is, suppose, so how do you average this kind of an information? So you take each of these activation maps. Suppose there are three only, right? Or suppose there are five. Here there's a dot dot dot. So you take each of these activation maps. This entire activation map you have taken, the blue one, and you average the value that is there inside. Okay, that makes up one neuron. Then you take the red one, you average it, and then that makes up your red neuron. And then you have, suppose there are other activation maps as well, and the last one is a green one. You average it and get the green neuron, right? So that is meant by the gap layer. So gap means global average pooling. So basically what you are doing is you take the conv layer, and whatever activation maps are inside it, you just average the values, and for each activation map you get an average value, and you just stack them like this and you get a new sort of a neural, hidden layer, right? And now what you do is, from here you attach a fully connected layer to get your final predictions. All right, so then what you do is something like this, that, okay, so, mm, yeah, suppose you want your uh, suppose you want to see like, suppose you have all these classes, suppose 1,000 classes, and you want to see like, in order to predict this class Australian terrier, what how did the net what parts of the network, I mean, what parts of the image are the net is the network focusing the most on. All right, so, mm, right, in order to do that, so this could have been anything. Suppose it could have been a mango as well. right? So here you are saying that to predict this Australian Terrier, what parts of the image are you focusing on the most? Is something like this. The question is something like this, right? So now what has happened is, so suppose this class Australian Terrier is there, and each of these, because this is a fully connected network, each of these will have a weight attached to it, right? So this weight is learned by the neural networks. And now we say that why don't you use these weights to basically weigh the activation maps, right? So now what you do is you take the blue one and you multiply it with W1. You take the red one and you multiply it with W2, and the green, then dot dot dot, and then the green one, and multiply it with WN, suppose, right? So this means this is like class activation map. So this is like the last convolution layer, and what you are doing is you are basically taking a what do you call it, a weighted sum of all these individual activation maps, okay, and the weights are given by these, right? So this one, like kind of, shows that, so this first activation map kind of focuses on one area in the image, the second one focuses on another area, and so on. And based on the weights, you finally see that your final class activation map is something like this. This means what? That in order to predict this Australian Terrier, by doing after doing the weighted average, you see that the most focused part of the image is this one, which is correct, right? Because this is looking at the dog. So this is what is meant by class activation map. And a little bit more detail about what a gap layer is. So suppose you have this sort of a activation map. Like here, the channel number of channels is really 3, okay, and you have, suppose this 6 cross 6 activation maps. So all you need to do for gap layer is you take this first one, you average it, and you get a neuron, you get a value, right? Second one, you take an average and you get a value. Third one, you take an average and you get a third value. All right, so that is what is meant by a gap layer. So basically all you are doing is you are averaging the information that is there inside each of these activation maps, and this average is going to give you something like a this seems like this has shortened your information a lot compared to this has averaged your information a lot, and it's like a, it turns out to be a vector at the end. So from this 3D, sorry, from this very very 3D architecture, you are getting something in the shape of a vector. That is the advantage of the gap. So the mathematically it looks something like this, that the gap layer is given as an input to a fully connected layer to compute the score of any class C. Okay. So suppose what you do is you have this, suppose this is the class activation map for your class C, where C might stand for this, suppose this one, right, this given one. So how do you compute it? You have the weights for it. Okay, so WKC means here W1 corresponds to the first activation map, W2 corresponds to the second activation map, and WN corresponds to the nth activation map. So that is what K stands for. K stands for the activation map number. Okay, and C again stands for the same class, right? So you obtain the weights as mentioned here, first of all, and here basically you do the average that I was talking about. So you have the feature map. So it's like this, that suppose this entire thing is called A, right? And you have this blue one. Suppose this blue one, we call it AIJ1 because this is the first activation map, right? So AIJ1, you just sum it and then you do an average, right? So this step is called global average pooling. This is the feature map, right? And you weight it by this WC1 because now suppose we have taken K to be 1, and then you sum it up all for all the K values, which means for all the activation maps, right? So this is what is the class activation map. So in other words, It's the same thing. So this formulation is also the same thing. What is going on here is that, oops, yeah. What is going on here is that class score. So class score is the linear weighted sum of the output of the gap layer, and right, we know this. And CAM is generated by the linear weighted sum of the output of the filters of the last conv layer. This also we know. So this is the formula that we saw in the last, in the last slide, right? And yeah, so now suppose we rearrange it a little bit so that 1 by z goes out. This ij summation goes out, and you bring the k things inside altogether. Okay, so this is nothing but this is basically the same thing, just that you are weighting your um, um, for class C, you are weighting your kth activation maps ijth position and summing it up. Okay, so that quantity is given by this mcij. This quantity, basically this inner summation is called mcij, and this is, if you think about it a little bit, it will come to you. It is basically cam at the location I comma j. Okay, so right, so this is give, and this is what, this is the kth output channel of the conv layer before gap. So again, as I say, k means, suppose if k equal to 2, it's like the second one. Cool. So, so basically, yeah, these are mathematical formulae, but in all, it's pretty easy to understand that all you are doing is you take individually each of these activation maps that are there in the last convolution layer, and you weight them by the weights that are given here, and you do a weighted average. That's it. Right. So one limitation with this aspect is that, so you may not always have, first of all, you have to always do it on the last convolution layer. What about the other ones which you would want to visualize probably? What if your network doesn't have a gap layer? Because it's not always necessary to have a gap layer. Maybe you can just flatten it and get a vector. So this, I mean, these are the limitations of this class activation map algorithm, that always you have to take the last one, and you have to have a gap layer for this to work. What if you don't have that? So for that, there is something called grad cam. Okay, so GradCam again is a very interesting and a very, in today's world, it's perhaps one of the most widely used visualization techniques, and it's very useful in multiple situations, scenarios like image classification, image captioning, visual question answering. So classification, again, the picture is very similar to what we are doing in class activation map only. The difference, so suppose you take a class, pick a class, Australian Terrier, Mango, or Strawberry, anything, and you're trying to see, like, to predict this particular class Mango, what are the neurons, what are the parts in the image that are, I mean, that are the most important, right? So you are doing a similar thing, just that now, instead of going for the last conv layer, you can pick any of these. Okay, so what you do is, suppose when you do image classification, you can pick up any class to visualize what part of the network, what part of the activation map basically influence this prediction. If it's image captioning is like you are predicting one word at a time. The question is that what word are you trying to predict? All right, so I mean, at a particular time step, the word that you are predicting, why did you predict that? Similarly, visual question answering is where you have been given an image and a question, and you want to answer the question based on the image. So again, that is also kind of a classification task only. So you have been given a predefined set of answers, and you are trying to find out, like, why a certain answer was picked up. Okay, so all that is done here is, this part doesn't matter to us. Suppose there is a certain activation map like this. Okay, so now what you do is, based on your class. Suppose this is the class that you want your to understand why this class was chosen. So all you have to do is for this particular layer conv layer activation maps, you want to find out the gradients with respect to this class. Okay, so already you know how to find gradients from one layer to another towards the back side. So it's like nothing but backprop. So some backprop steps. So you take this to be the starting step and you backprop to here. All right, and yeah, so you backprop till here because you want to visualize what is going on here. Okay, and from this backprop basically by so this backprop will basically give us some weights. So the problem with suppose this class activation map architecture was you could not have the weights before. Suppose you wanted to visualize this particular conv layer, you didn't know how to look at the weights, right? So this gives us a direct gradcam gives us a direct way of doing that. So basically you using the gradients, right, you try to find out what are the weights, what would be the weights to basically combine them. The rest of the steps are same, right? And there's a relu class here, relu activation here. Why? Because we only want to like find out like what are the neurons or parts of the convolution map which positively affect the classification, not negatively. So that's why the relu is there, right? So okay, this is the mathematical formulation of grad cam, and it's you can see that it's not very different from what we saw in what do we call it? So it's not very different from what we saw in class activation map. So all that is happening over here is what I said. So you take the particular class you want to target and you find the gradients of these layers with respect to that class, right? So what will that give? Suppose you have this particular activation map k equal to where k equal to 1, okay? And so now remember that gradients are always same of the same shape as the input. So the gradient with respect to this of the final class would be same as the shape here, this shape, correct? So now what you do is, so you have got a gradient of this same shape, right? All you do is average that gradient and that average value will give you the weight. Okay, so it's exactly that. So you have this class C YC, this is the probability, and then you back propagate, you not back propagate, you basically find the gradient of YC with respect to AIJK, right? And then what you do is you do a you do an average of that over all the, so inside the kth activation map you do an average over all the ij, right? That is given by this function, and that basically stands for your weight. So we call it alpha k c. So c for class, k for the kth activation map, and then the rest is very similar. So you can understand, I hope, that the formulations are the computations are very similar to what we have in class activation map, just that suppose we are we are finding the weights in a different way, and we can basically pick any conv layer to visualize. So then what we do is we pick each activation map uh, where so this for the super of the superscript k, and we weight it by this weight that we just found, right? And we do a linear combination of them just like we were doing in scam, and we append a ReLU on top of it to do away with the negative influences, right? So that is the theory that I had for today, and let's also look at some code quickly, because yeah, the coding part is the most interesting part. So yeah, let's try to run this. Okay, it will allocate first, that will take a little bit of time. Right. So it's already running. So these are all the import functions that we want to run. And now, so PyTorch already, so Torch Vision is basically the library containing all your vision algorithms. And this particular line, so is perhaps of the most interest to us from Torch Vision import models. So this consists of all the pre-trained models that are there, right? So model equal to models dot resonate 50 pre-trained equal to true. Okay, this means that we pick up a model, we pick up a pre-trained model from the models library, which is resonate 50, and its pre-trained equal to true means that the model is pre-trained on ImageNet. Okay, so it's already pre-trained, and what we do here is this line means that what we do is the ResNet 50 model is a huge model. Let's also do this. What we want is to get the last layer. So we are doing as it says here, we are working around class activation maps, and that is why what we want is the last layer, last convolution layer. So here after that you see there's only average pool and FC. So we need, that is why they picked up this layer 4, right? Cool. So now this part of the code basically this, so did we run this? Yeah. So this part of the code, what it does is it stores the feature maps of the last convolution layer of the image after a forward pass. So um, yeah, so what we need is based on what we saw here, going back, we want this structure we want with respect to the, oops, sorry, with respect to the last convolution. So right, so let's go back to the code. Yeah, so that is done by this particular class, where a hook is like a hook. It basically extracts the feature that you want to extract at whatever layer that you want. You have to define all those things. So here M stands for a model, and yeah, I mean it basically it's nothing but it's a fancier way, it's a good way of storing the features that you, it's a good way of basically storing the features that you want to store. So you want the last convolution layer feature maps, and those are stored using this function, right? So this, let's create a object of this function called fb using the final conv layer. Okay, so the final conv layer, so now that you have passed this, uh, right, so now that you have passed this will store the feature maps for you. Okay, so we ran this. Next is, right, so next is that we have to, so we already talked about this last time, so we wanted to do some um, some augmentations probably. So yeah, so some data augmentations are required because you are, what you are doing, you are basically you are giving an image and you are not training the network here. Note that for cam, grad cam, anything, you are not, training is now no longer a part of the process. You already have a trained model. You are trying to see like what is going on inside your network neurons basically. So what you do is, you whatever image you give to the network as input, that has to be resized to 224, and it has to be normalized using some mean and std. So these are because this resonant 50 has been pre-trained on ImageNet and you haven't trained it by yourself in any way. You are resizing the image and you are normalizing it so that the image size and the, I mean size becomes equal to that of the ImageNet images, and it's normalized accordingly, right? So these transforms are necessary for your network to work, right? And so now let's look at this image. Suppose we have a tiger image like this. Let's also run this code, right? So this is how the tiger image looks like. And now what you want to do is you want to first find out like okay, so you want to first extract your image the features basically. So you have this input tensor, right? And then you have the so this input tensor is nothing but you have used the transform function on this original image that was there. So you convert it into a tensor. Okay, and also what you need to do is, so the neural networks, they are basically used to looking at seeing batches of images. So since you have one image here, you have to, it's like you have a batch of one size one. So that is what is done by the unsqueeze function. So 3 cross 224 cross 298 image is converted to 1 cross 3 cross 224 cross 298. That means that there's a batch size of 1, right? Then you do not want your model to train anymore. That's why model equal to model.eval, right? And then what you do is, you giving this input tensor, you get the output values. So these are basically your um, output logics, what you call the class values, right? And then you have the feature maps. So these feature maps, as you can see, by using this fb object, you can very neatly get hold of the feature maps, right? So the output shape, let's again run it also to, yeah, so the output shape is given by this out dot shape. So this out dot shape, you can see that it's 1 cross 1000. 1 here stands for the batch size. There are 1000 classes in ImageNet. That is why this is, the output shape is 1 cross 1000. And similarly, these are your all your output scores basically. And the feature map that you extracted is of shape like this. So again, this one stands for batch size. 2048 is basically, there are 2048 activation maps. It's the channel basically, and the size is 7 cross 10. So just see how small the size is of the activation map. It's just a 7 cross 10 activation map, right? And now you want to convert your output scores to probabilities using the softmax function that is given by this line. Then what you do is, you have a score, and yeah, so you have a score comma. So what you want to do is, out of the probabilities, you want to see like what is the highest probability class for the given image. So that is given by this max function. So this gives out two things. One is the highest score that was given by these probability values, and next is the what do we call it, the class. Okay, so the class which has the highest probability value. So now printing these, we ran this cell. So yeah, we got an 81% highest score among all the 1000 classes, and we see that the class predicted was 292. So 292 is the index of the tiger class. So hence, I mean, yeah, this worked out fine. So we gave a tiger image, and the model is predicting tiger, right? And now next step would be to get the weights and biases associated with the FC layer, because yeah, we need these weights, remember. So yeah, so this is what we do, weights and biases. We get all the weights and biases from the FC layer. So this is how to get the FC layer and do a dot parameters. So the weights, let's run this as well. Yeah, so the weights are of shape 1000 cross 2048, and biases have shape 1000 because your output is of 1000 size. 2048 is why 2048 is because you had a gap layer. So again, going by this image, you have converted your, this was, if you remember, its size is, so 7 cross 10 cross 2048. So now you have converted this to vector. What will be the size of the vector? It will be same as the number of channels here, right? So that is why you have a 2048 here, right? So now what you do next, yeah, what you do next is, for this particular class, the tiger class, right? You get the weights that were there, all the class weights, right? So that is given by this. So weights and biases, all you need to do is get the weights that were belonging to that particular class tiger, right? So that is where you use the so that is why your class weight shape is again 2048, because you are getting a weight value for each of the classes. Cool. So now, correct. So did we do this? No. Yes. So in order for this thing to work, so what was our formula? Formula was that you would want the weights to be multiplied with each of the corresponding activation maps, and that is what is done here. So the main uh, calculation is basically, yeah, so these are just some weight adjustments. So you basically reshape the class weights so that they work out. um, right, correct. So now, uh, okay, did we do something wrong here? Okay, this probably, let's see. Mhm. Yeah. So what you did was, so you have this shape. Now they can be multiplied, the class weights and the feature maps. So this is what you do. You do a weighted sum over here using this piece of code, and what you get is something like this. The class activation map that got the average class activation map that got generated. And now you have some visualization techniques. So I'm not going into the details of them, in order to visualize like what parts of the code were the most necessary. uh, I mean the what parts of the this input image did the model think to be the most necessary. So you need to basically do some yeah, so this step is where you resize the tensor. So the original activation map, if you remember, it's of size just this 7 cross 10. What you want instead is what you instead is to find an activation map which is same size as the size of the image, and so you do some superimposing in these steps, right? And now after the superimposing, you see that these are the most important parts of the image that the network thought to predict the true class. So this yellow class, this means that it's looking at the correct region of the tiger to predict the image, right? So this is how class activation map works. And similarly, GradCam also, I'm not going to going into too much detail of it. So more or less the details are same. You have a pre-trained model, again the same ResNet model, right? And now what you do is, this time you need the gradients, right? So what, even though your model is in eval mode, you turn on the gradients so that gradients are computed in fact, and you store them. So this is basically, this step is for this entire functionality is for storing your gradient values, because if you remember, what we wanted was to, yeah, what you wanted was to get the gradients uh, via backprop to a certain convolution layer, and you wanted to do a global average pooling on top of them in order to get the weights, right? And then you would combine your do a weighted average of your activation maps for that layer and do a redo, right? So that is why you need the gradients, and this particular step does that. Let's run this. Okay, let's run this also. Mhm. And this initializes the GradCam model. So these steps are again very, so you again have the same tiger image, and you do the same, transformations and all, right? And here what you do is, you have this input image, you have the output along with the activation map that you want, right? And now you have the certain activation, and you all you do is, you have this cross entropy loss, right? And cross entropy loss with respect to certain class 600. So remember our tiger class had a index of 292 or something. So here you have a 600 index class. So you do a you find the loss with respect to that class. You do a backprop through that loss and you get the gradients. You store them, you get the gradients and you store them, right? And now what you do is once you get the gradients, all you need to do is you need to what we saw here in this image. Yeah, you get the gradients at each of the locations and all you do is an average of them. So sorry, that is given by sorry, my bad. So that is given by this particular functionality, this pooled grads. All right. And then for, yeah, so pooled grads gives you this, basically gives you the weights. Okay, and now all you have to do is, so the later steps are basically we know them already. So the weighted average thing that we wanted, and that is given by this step. Great. So cool. So this is basically nothing but to visualize the entire thing. There's a heat map. So let's run this function. So some steps here you can see that these are not done by the transforms function, but they are done by ourselves, so that this will give you a better idea of what the individual functionalities were. You are resizing them, you are normalizing the image, you are doing a image minus mean by standard deviation. All these steps are there. Similarly, the heat map also that you generated, that also is resized to size 224 cross 224. Right. So let's plot this. So yeah, you'll see that probably it's not really looking at, because if we are looking at a different class now, the colors are not very well understood here. So it's looking at different parts of the image because we are not looking at it for the tiger class, right? And yeah, we do some thresholding and this is what the plot looks like. So this is how basically your GradCam works. So this is the code for it, and yeah, I mean this is a very useful tool. So you have to use GradCam once or at least once in your life in order to understand how the neural networks process these different images. And I mean basically it gives you a good, why it's interesting is because it, like this, it gives you a good understanding of why the neural network is doing what it is doing. Also, another application would be that suppose if the neural network is predicting the right class, but it's still looking at the wrong regions of the image. That also gives us an insight, because in that case, if it's looking at the wrong regions in the image to predict the correct class, that means that it learned wrong things. Even though it's predicting the correct class, it's actually learning wrong things. So that is why this GradCam type of approaches are so necessary and you'll need to use them. So yeah, I think that's it for today. So yeah, we'll end it.